Those who know how close the connection is between the state of mind of a man, his courage and hopes, or lack of them, and the state of immunity of his body will understand that the sudden loss of hope and courage can lead to a deadly effect. The ultimate cause of my friend's death was that the expectation of liberation did not come, and he was severely disappointed. This suddenly lowered his body's resistance against the latent typhus infection. His faith in the future and his will to live on became paralyzed, and his body fell victim to illness, and thus the voice of his dream was right after all. This is a passage from Viktor Frankl's memoir, Man's Search for Meaning, in which he covers the horrifying events and conditions that prisoners of the Nazi concentration camps endured during World War II. It is valuable insight into the human psychology during times of struggle that we're lucky to have, which is why it is highly regarded as a must-read in the psychological and philosophical communities. The previous passage references the correlation between the loss of hope and the decline in physical health during trying times. During his time in the camp, a fellow prisoner referenced as F shared with Victor a dream he had in which a voice told him he could wish for any answer he sought. And I quote, "What do you think?" I asked. "That I would like to know when the war would be over for me. You know what I mean, doctor, for me. I wanted to know when our camp would be liberated and our sufferings come to an end." When asked what the dream voice answered, F whispered, "March 30th. At that time, it was the beginning of March of 1945, and his dream had occurred that previous month. As March approached its end and the liberation seemed less and less likely, F became ill and lost consciousness on the date his dream had prophesied, March 30th. He died the next day. I wanted to mention this passage as it relates to the topic of this video. Liberating ourselves from expectations, those of our own and others, to discover more freedom in life. Today we find ourselves bombarded by the expectations of others and those that we place upon ourselves based on worldly influences. There was a time, perhaps just a few decades ago, when these influences were fairly limited, primarily to those we encounter on a day-to-day basis. There are the expectations of our families on what we should do with our lives, the expectations of our partners on how we should live, the expectations that our friends create socially on how we should spend our time. There are job expectations on what makes a great employee, spiritual and religious expectations on what doctrines we should live by. In current times, these influences of the external world that can seep into our minds and become adapted into our own expectations are more readily available. All we have to do is open our phones and or connect to the internet. And there we are, presented with various forums, videos, breaking news articles, social media posts filled with comments on what is correct and incorrect, good and bad, all to be consumed and influence our lives. All of these sources have their way of influencing the way we judge ourselves. We feel guilty for not honoring the expectations those around us have placed upon us and those we have placed upon ourselves because of them. Am I a failure? Am I a horrible individual for wanting to follow my instinct, my own path? What will people think of me if I do not have a huge home with a few expensive toys outside? What would they think of me if I work this job or leave that one? If I do not follow this political party, will I be an outcast? If I make this decision, will I anger them? If I do not dress a certain way, speak a certain way, go with the crowd, what will society think of me? Have I lived up to what others think I am? If I grow and change, will they have a problem with it? In such a social world, it can become easy to adapt others' definition of success and happiness. This adaptation has its way of creating a roadblock between us and our true selves, our true potential. We can quite easily find ourselves chasing objects, possessions, and statuses that do not truly reflect who we are. We can also find ourselves living our day-to-day lives with the unconscious desire to please others, to be viewed a certain way by others, to fit in where they need us to help keep them happy at the expense of ourselves. All because of expectations and the standards they create on what is acceptable and what is not, the norm and that which is not. We're all familiar with the typical good and bad conscience that is usually displayed as a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other, both of which are battling for our attention, trying to influence the decisions we make. Let us substitute these figures and their voices where on one shoulder, rather than having an angel, we have our true being. This is our true self. On the other shoulder, rather than having a devil, we have a version of ourselves that is a product of worldly expectations. As we go about our lives, these two versions of ourselves are constantly trying to guide us in different directions. In one ear, we are told to live in accordance to our being, to carve our own path. In the other ear, We are constantly bombarded to do that which pleases society and those around us, to fit in exactly where others need us while neglecting where we need ourselves. The latter voice, I feel, can often be the loudest, drowning out the voice that is attempting to guide us to find what we truly seek in life. I recall a quote from the music artist Akon in a recent Hotboxing with Mike Tyson podcast in which they were discussing love versus nature. Akon spoke about how men are naturally breeders and that our drive to do so is completely natural. We won't speak about this particular subject as it is not the topic at hand, but something he mentioned during this conversation is what caught my attention. He said, and I quote, "We make all these rules on life without taking nature into account." This struck me, not necessarily as a surprise, but more so as a summary of a realization I have been coming to terms with. Through the past few years, I have delved further and further into philosophical reading, in particular, Stoic texts. I have found Stoicism to be a great source of comfort during tough times due to its constant reminders to not worry about events and happenings that are not under our control. Another important theme that you will find expressed and advised quite often by the ancient Stoic philosophers, whether it be Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, or others with surviving texts, is that we should live in accordance with nature, not against it. This theme extends beyond human nature to encapsulate the nature of all things. For example, a natural element of life is death. Every living creature to ever experience life will someday pass on. It is not our duty to only live, but to die and make way for new life. To resent death, in a way, can be thought of as resenting our nature. Every living creature goes about its life in accordance with its nature. And though the world can be a very vicious and hostile place, it somehow maintains a balance. A part of our human nature is to explore. It is the reason we have discovered so much about our planet Earth and seek to explore other regions of space as well. We are curious individuals seeking to learn, grow, and develop. If we were not so, there's the possibility that we would not exist to this day. If we had confined ourselves to one region of the Earth, we may have been wiped out by a natural disaster that struck that particular region. If we were not curious enough to try different remedies for diseases and injuries, perhaps we would not have developed the knowledge to survive the plagues of the past. This gives us an idea of how living in accordance with our nature helped us to survive to this day. Another part of our nature also wishes to seek the world within us. We wish to discover more about ourselves, our true wants and desires, and realize our true potential. Going back to what Akon stated about making rules without taking nature into account, in a way, this can go against our human nature, suppressing our curiosity and drive to explore. At the core, an expectation is a belief or prediction about the future. An expectation in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be quite beneficial. For example, those who expected store shelves to be devoid of toilet paper at the initial outbreak of the pandemic of 2020 and stocked up, found themselves seated in a fairly good position when the prediction came true. When expectations become implicit rules on more serious matters such as how to live life, however, we enter into a danger zone. Suddenly, people begin making certain decisions in life because they are what's expected of them. Some may choose certain career pursuits because they are what those around them expect of them, determined by their ethnicity, location, family history, and so on. We dress and behave in certain ways because of social expectations to do so. We live our lives limited by the pressures created by those around us to conform to their expectations. All the while doing so, it becomes increasingly difficult to tell the difference between whether we are living in accordance with ourselves or if we are living in accordance to the version of ourselves that the outside world confines us to be. No freedom exists in that. And just as mankind would likely not exist if it ignored his nature, we cease to exist when we ignore ours. So in this way, expectations can also be dangerous. Alongside the danger that exists when those we are consumed by don't play out as we wish, as so happened with F that ultimately led to his illness and death. I say all of this as over the course of recent time in my life, I have increasingly become more aware of both outside worldly expectations and those I have placed upon myself. A few years ago, I actively began the journey of self-discovery to discover more of myself and reach my potential. I feel that this, along with growing older and gaining more experience in life, has led me to the point of questioning my own expectations. One expectation of which that I feel has in recent times seemed to rule over my mind to an unhealthy degree is the expectation that someday liberation would come. I developed this idea that someday, hopefully soon, I would find peace in my life and that all the answers would reveal themselves. As time went on, I began questioning more often when this peace would come. Unfortunately, I was not visited by a voice in my dreams that could reveal the answer to me, like F was. However, I recently realized that what I sought is all around me. that the peace I've longed for exists in the very nature of man, that peace exists in a state of mind that lives in accordance with nature, and that in those very moments that we are able to liberate ourselves from expectations, those of ours and those of others, in those moments, we experience freedom and peace. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.